I am Myrna Skolny and welcome to the first in my series of videos exploring early Staffordshire pottery figures. These figures were made in England, mainly in the county of Staffordshire, between 1780 and 1840. For most people, the words antique Staffordshire pottery figure conjure up images of figures looking rather like these sweet spaniels, or this large hound with its keeper, or this couple clad in Scottish garb. Figures of this type are Staffordshire pottery, but they were made in the Victorian era, sometime after 1840. They are antique, but they're not the early figures that are the subject of this video. So, at the risk of being repetitive, early Staffordshire figures, our topic today, were fashioned from around 1780, when the figure potting industry really got going, till about 1840, when, as we'll see, figure styles changed significantly. Early figures give us glimpses of a world we couldn't otherwise see because photography hadn't yet been introduced and printed imagery for the masses was in its infancy, as you see here. These figures are important historical artifacts, and we see in them the full spectrum of everyday life as it was then. We see courtships. Notice the tree-like structure behind this eager suitor and his reluctant lady. It's called a bocage, and bocages are common on both pottery and porcelain figures of this period. You see weddings. The very determined bride on the left doesn't wear a white dress because white dresses weren't yet customary attire, so a bride simply wore her best dress and she expected to wear it many more times. We see christenings, in this case a baptism of an infant called Mary, and tender family moments from the past that today would be captured in photographs are here instead captured in clay. This spiffy twosome modelled fashions of their day. The gentleman wears a corset to cinch his waist. Times certainly have changed. We see pastimes old and new. Reading was being introduced to the masses for the very first time, and reformers were endorsing gardening as an appropriately improving way to spend one's leisure hours. Landed gentlemen whiled away their leisure hours pursuing game, and ladies took up archery, the one sport they could enjoy alongside gentlemen, and posing with that bow drawn afforded a lady fine opportunity to showcase her figure. England's very first human sports stars rose to fame in this period. Still remembered today are the English pugilist Thomas Cribb and his American counterpart Thomas Molyneux. In 1810, they staged the very first international boxing match. We see people at mundane daily tasks, a lady drawing water from the neighborhood water pump and a blacksmith at his anvil. Farm workers who were the rural poor of their time, a lady milking her cows, and a beautiful shepherdess. Entertainment of all sorts is portrayed in Staffordshire pottery. We see those amazing travelling menageries, zoos on wheels if you will, that traversed the English countryside then, and troops of performing animals that entertained the public at fairs and on street corners. These circus performers give us a glimpse of the circus in its early years when it was all about equestrianism, and in addition to stars of the stage, we see humble street entertainers, including this former American slave named Billy Waters. Of course, we see wild animals of every sort, so let's peep at just a few. Deer were valued then as adornments for the parks on great estates. Lions come in all shapes and sizes, most often with friendly rather than fearsome faces. We have tigers and leopards and elephants and bears. The list goes on and on. We have the huge, improved farm animals at the heart of the agricultural revolution. Sheep, of course, and cows too. Naturally, we have domestic animals. This handsome setter was probably a prized hunting dog, but I like to think the spaniel with pups was a cosseted companion. We see cats, which then were not yet valued as domestic pets, and even this tiny mouse, perhaps a child's pet, was captured in clay. Pottery figures bear witness to news events of their day. This trio recalls the notorious Red Barn murder of 1827. You see William Corder and Maria Martin outside the Red Barn on Corder's farm. Corder murdered Martin and buried her body beneath the Red Barn floor. Here we have the Red Barn in the center, Corder and Martin arm in arm to one side, and Corder as he appeared before the judge on the other. Needless to say, he swung from the gallows for his crime. Also remembered are the great political and social movements of the era. In 1833, abolitionists secured emancipation of slaves in Britain's colonial empire. This slave kneels in gratitude, broken chains are at his feet, and the open book on his knee reads, "Bless God, thank Britain, me no slave." Less successful was the teetotal movement's attempt to bring sobriety to Britain, but as we know, that battle continues to this day. We see important people from previous centuries. On the left, the poet and author Geoffrey Chaucer, and on the right, that influential scientist Sir Isaac Newton. An array of classical figures reflect the interest in the classics that prevailed then. Venus, the goddess of love, was a firm favorite. Here she stands with the god Apollo, whom the ancients believed epitomized beauty. Her companion is more often the sea god Neptune. Here she stands with him and with her son Cupid at her side. Last but not least, umpteen figures remind us that religion then was close to the heart of every English person. We see humble peasants kneeling in prayer and a wide range of Bible stories depicted in figural form. Here Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. We see Samuel anointing a youthful David as king of Israel, and many portrayals of Elijah and the widow of Zarephath, for these seem to have been Staffordshire Potter's favorite biblical subjects. All the early figures we've looked at have been rather complex objects. For another example, look at the detail on these two unassuming little 6-inch figures. Each has been meticulously modeled and decorated all the way around. Notice the grapes in her hand, and the detailed modelling of the wheat sheaf he holds, as well as all the folds in his shirt. Even the faces were painted with great care. Early Staffordshire figures were all made by pressing clay into moulds, letting it dry, and then assembling all the moulded parts into a single object that was ready for firing, glazing and painting. I can't begin to guess how many moulds were required to make this relatively simple group. Multiple moulded parts would have been needed for each of the lady's limbs, her torso, her head and her lute. Similarly for the gentleman. Even the cockade on her hat required several moulded parts, as did his, to accommodate both the separate feathers and the flower. And don't forget the bocage and the base, as well as all the assorted animals, each of which needed several moulds. And all these parts had to be made, meticulously assembled, fired, glazed and fired again before pretty enamel colors were applied. Knowing this, we can't fail to marvel at the manufacture of complex groups, and isn't it astounding to think that these fragile artifacts have survived 2 centuries? The figures we've enjoyed today were made before 1840, but figure making continued into the Victorian era and beyond. Let's revisit the Victorian figures we saw at the start of this video, and we'll see that figures became a whole lot simpler so as to make them more affordable for a larger market. This 12-inch Victorian figure was made circa 1870 from only 2 moulded parts. No separate arms, legs and heads here. 1 part for the front, 1 for the back. Only a few colours were used for the relatively sparse decoration. Similarly, these 2 little Victorian spaniels. The red dog of circa 1850 is made from 2 moulded parts, 1 for the front and 1 for the back, and the back is largely undecorated, while the black dog, perhaps made a tad earlier, needed 4 moulds to accommodate that separate front leg, and he is sparsely painted on the back. And the Scottish couple of circa 1850 needed but 2 moulded parts and very little painting. Change did not happen overnight, and more complex figures continued to be made, but they were few and far between, and cheap and cheerful became the name of the game. Again, I am Myrna Skolny, and you can learn more about early Staffordshire figures by reading my books. Please visit my website, mystaffordshirefigures.com, which provides a wealth of information and a free download of my latest book titled Obsession. My help is always free, so if you have questions or need advice, please email me at this address. You've just watched the first video in my series on early Staffordshire pottery figures, and I hope you'll want to watch the others too.